The morning sun was just breaking over the California hills when Thomas packed his wagon for the long journey to San Francisco. It was 1863, and the gold rush had turned the sleepy port town into a wild, bustling city where fortunes were made and lost in a single day. Thomas needed supplies for his ranch, tools, medicine, and fabric his wife had been asking for since winter. Thomas was different from most men in those parts. He had come from Scotland 15 years earlier with nothing but strong hands and a good heart. Through hard work and fair dealing, he had built one of the most successful ranches in the valley. His neighbors respected him, not just for his success, but for his character. He was known as a man who kept his word and helped others when they needed it. The 3-day journey to San Francisco gave Thomas time to think. His ranch was doing well, but he worried about his 3 sons. Robert, James, and William were good young men, but they spent too much time working and not enough time thinking about settling down. At 28, 26, and 24, they should have been married by now. But living so far from town, they rarely met suitable women. When Thomas reached San Francisco, the city hit him like a wall of noise and smells, ships crowded. The harbor, their masts looking like a forest of bare trees. The streets were packed with people from every corner of the world, Americans heading west, Chinese workers, Mexican traders, and European immigrants like himself. Everyone was chasing the same dream of striking it rich. Thomas had been to the city many times, but it still amazed him how quickly it had grown. Buildings went up overnight, and fortunes changed just as fast. But with all that gold and opportunity came darker things too. He had heard stories of crime, corruption, and worse, but he had never seen it with his own eyes. After finishing his business at the general store, Thomas was loading his wagon when he heard shouting from down the street. A crowd had gathered near the docks, and something about the noise made his stomach tighten. It wasn't the usual sound of merchants haggling or drunks arguing. This was different, angrier. Against his better judgment, Thomas walked toward the crowd. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the center of the crowd stood 3 young Chinese women. They couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. But it was their eyes that struck Thomas the most, wide with terror. Like cornered animals who knew they were about to die. 2 rough-looking men stood beside them, clearly the ones doing the selling. One was tall and thin with a scraggly beard, the other shorter but built like a bull. They were shouting prices to the crowd, treating these young women like cattle at market, fresh from the boat. The tall one yelled, "These 3 will work hard and cause no trouble. Perfect for mining camps or whatever else you need them for." His laugh was cruel and cold. Thomas felt sick. He had heard that such things happened, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. These were someone's daughters, stolen from their families and brought here against their will. The crowd around them was mostly made up of rough miners and settlers, men who had been away from civilization too long and forgotten how to treat other human beings. One of the girls, the smallest one, swayed on her feet like she might faint. She was so thin Thomas could see her bones through her torn dress. When had they last been fed? When had they last felt safe? "What am I bid for all 3? The bull-like man shouted. "They're young and strong. They'll last you years if you treat them right." Numbers started flying from the crowd. $10. 20, 30. Each bid felt like a knife in Thomas's chest. He thought of his own daughter, taken by fever when she was just 12. What would he have wanted someone to do if she had been in this situation? The bidding climbed higher. $50, 70. These weren't amounts that poor men could afford. The bidders were serious, and Thomas could guess what they planned to do with these girls. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then something inside Thomas snapped. Maybe it was thinking of his daughter. Maybe it was remembering his own struggles as a stranger in a new land. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that he couldn't stand by and watch this happen. $100, he called out, his voice cutting through the crowd. The crowd turned to look at him. Thomas was well-dressed compared to most of them, but he was clearly out of place. His clean shirt and decent hat marked him as a rancher, not a miner or drifter. 100 for all 3? the tall seller asked, surprised. That's right, Thomas said, stepping forward. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. Well, well, the man grinned, showing yellow teeth. Looks like we have ourselves a serious buyer. Anyone want to go higher than the gentleman's 100? The crowd murmured, but no one spoke up. $100 was more money than most of these men saw in 6 months. Thomas held his breath, praying no one would outbid him. He had exactly $130 in his pocket, his entire savings for the trip. Going once, the seller called. Going twice. Sold to the gentleman for $100. Thomas walked forward on unsteady legs, pulling the money from his pocket. As he handed it over, he caught the eyes of the 3 girls. They looked at him with the same terror they had shown the crowd. To them, he was just another buyer, another man who would hurt them. They're your problem now, the tall man said, pocketing the money. Good luck with them. Chinese women can be tricky. The crowd began to break up, disappointed that the show was over. Thomas stood there with the 3 girls, suddenly realizing he had no plan for what came next. He had acted on instinct, but now he had to figure out how to help them. The girls huddled together, speaking quickly in Chinese. They were trying to figure out what this new owner would do to them. Thomas wished he could tell them they were safe, but they wouldn't understand his words. And he didn't blame them for not trusting his actions. Slowly, carefully, Thomas gestured toward his wagon. He tried to make his movements gentle and non-threatening, the way he would approach a scared horse. The girls followed at a distance, ready to run if he made any sudden moves. As they walked through the busy streets toward his wagon, Thomas's mind raced. He had just spent nearly all his money and taken on the responsibility of 3 traumatized young women. His wife would be shocked. His sons would be confused. The neighbors would talk, but looking at these 3 girls, so young, so scared, so far from home, Thomas knew he had done the right thing. Somehow he would figure out the rest. He had to. These girls deserved a chance at a real life, not the nightmare they had been forced into. The wagon seemed very small suddenly, with 3 extra passengers who didn't trust him and couldn't understand him. It was going to be a very long ride home. But for the first time since he had seen them, Thomas noticed something different in the girls' eyes. The pure terror was still there, but underneath it, he thought he saw the smallest spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they sensed that this time would be different. The wagon wheels creaked loudly as they rolled out of San Francisco. Thomas sat on the driver's seat, holding the reins with sweaty palms. Behind him, the 3 Chinese girls sat as far away from him as possible. Pressed against the back of the wagon like frightened birds, the silence was deafening. Thomas had never felt so uncomfortable in his own wagon. Every few minutes he would glance back to check on them, but each time he turned, they would shrink back even further. He couldn't blame them. From their point of view, he was just another stranger who had bought them for unknown purposes. The youngest girl kept coughing, a dry, harsh sound that worried Thomas. She was so thin he could count her ribs through her torn dress. When had they last eaten a proper meal? The other 2 girls took turns holding her steady as the wagon bounced over the rough road. Thomas tried to think of ways to communicate that. He meant no harm. He had learned a few words of Spanish from his Mexican neighbors, but Chinese was completely foreign to him. How do you tell someone in gestures that you want to help them? Every move he made seemed to frighten them more. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas realized they would need to stop for water soon. He had brought enough for himself, but not for 3 extra people. There was a creek about an hour ahead where they could rest and refill their water bottles. When Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop beside the creek, the girls tensed up immediately. The oldest one, she couldn't have been more than 17, put her arms protectively around the other 2. Thomas could see the fear in their eyes. They thought this was where something terrible would happen. Moving very slowly, Thomas climbed down from the wagon. He held up his hands to show he wasn't carrying any weapons, then pointed to the creek and made drinking motions with his cupped hands. The girls watched him carefully but didn't move. Thomas walked to the creek alone, filled his water bottle, and drank from it to show it was safe. Then he filled it again and walked slowly back to the wagon, setting the bottle down within there. reached before backing away several steps. The youngest girl was clearly desperate for water. She kept licking her cracked lips and staring at the bottle. Finally, the oldest girl reached out quickly, grabbed the bottle, and pulled it back to their corner of the wagon. They shared it carefully, each taking only small sips to make it last, watching them. Thomas felt his heart break a little more. These girls had learned not to trust anyone or anything. They expected every kindness to come with a terrible price. He wondered what horrors they had already endured. Thomas spent the next hour trying to earn their trust in small ways. He shared his food, leaving portions where they could reach them without getting too close to him. He gathered fresh grass for them to sit on instead of the rough wagon boards. When the youngest girl started shivering despite the warm day, he very carefully placed his spare blanket nearby and backed away. The oldest girl seemed to be the leader. She had intelligent eyes and watched Thomas's every move, trying to figure out what kind of man he was. Sometimes Thomas caught her studying his face when she thought he wasn't looking. He tried to keep his expression gentle and calm the way he did when training a wild horse. By the second day, small changes began to happen. The youngest girl stopped flinching quite so much when Thomas moved around the wagon. The middle girl, who had the most expressive face, actually made eye contact with him once or twice. And the oldest girl began to relax her protective stance just slightly. The breakthrough came when they stopped for the night. Thomas was setting up camp when he heard the youngest girl's cough getting worse. She was clearly running a fever, and her breathing sounded labored. The other two girls were trying to help her, but they looked scared and helpless. Thomas knew he had to do something, even if it frightened them. He slowly approached the wagon, making soft, reassuring sounds the way he would to calm a sick animal. The oldest girl tensed up, ready to fight him if necessary, but she didn't try to stop him when she saw he was focused on her sick friend. Thomas had some medicine in his supplies, herbs his wife used for fevers and coughs. He showed the packet to the oldest girl, then pantomimed drinking it. She looked suspicious, so Thomas mixed a small amount with water and drank it himself to prove it wasn't poison. The sick girl was getting worse. Her friends were whispering urgently in Chinese, clearly worried about her. Finally, the oldest girl nodded to Thomas and helped prop up her friend so she could drink the medicine for the next few hours. Thomas sat nearby, keeping the fire going and checking on the sick girl regularly. He didn't try to get too close, but he made sure they knew he was watching over them. Gradually, the medicine began to work and the girl's fever broke. That night was the first time the girls fell into deep sleep instead of the light, nervous dozing they had done before. Thomas stayed awake most of the night, keeping watch and making sure the fire didn't die out. He was exhausted, but seeing them finally rest peacefully made it worthwhile. On the third morning, everything was different. The youngest girl was much better, and all three of them looked at Thomas with something that wasn't quite trust yet, but wasn't pure fear either. When he offered them breakfast, they didn't wait as long before accepting it. When he helped the youngest girl down from the wagon so she could walk around and get her strength back, she didn't pull away from his touch. The oldest girl even tried to communicate with him. She pointed to herself and said something in Chinese that Thomas assumed was her name. Then she pointed to her friends and said their names too. Thomas repeated the sounds as best he could, making them giggle, the first happy sound he had heard from them. Thomas pointed to himself and said Thomas several times until they could repeat it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were no longer just scared girls and a strange man. They were people with names. As they got closer to home, Thomas began to worry about a different problem. How would he explain this to his wife? Margaret was a good woman with a kind heart, but 3 Chinese girls was not what she would be expecting when he returned from his supply run. The girls seemed to sense they were approaching their destination. They sat up straighter and looked around more alertly. Thomas wondered what they were thinking. Were they hoping this place would be better than where they had been? Were they planning to run away at the first chance? Did they have any idea that he actually wanted to help them? When the ranch finally came into view, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. He was home, but the real challenge was just beginning. His wife came out to greet him, then stopped short when she saw his passengers. Margaret's face went through several expressions: confusion, shock, concern, and finally a kind of understanding as she took in the girl's condition. She might not know the whole story yet, but she could see that these were people who needed help. The three Chinese girls climbed down from the wagon carefully, staying close together as they looked around at their new surroundings. They saw the neat farmhouse, the well-tended fields, and the curious faces of Thomas's three sons who had come out to see what was happening. For a moment, everyone just stared at each other. Then Margaret stepped forward with the same gentle manner she used with injured animals, and Thomas knew that somehow everything was going to work out. The hardest part of the journey was over. Now the real work of building trust and understanding could begin. Margaret stood on the porch steps, her hands smoothing down her apron as she watched the three Chinese girls climb down from the wagon. Her husband's face told her this wasn't a simple business trip story. These girls looked like they had been through something terrible. Without saying a word, Margaret walked down to meet them. The girls pressed closer together, unsure what to expect from this new stranger. But when Margaret smiled and gestured toward the house, speaking in a soft, motherly voice, something in their posture relaxed slightly. "Come inside, dears," Margaret said gently. "You must be tired and hungry." The girls couldn't understand her words, but they understood kindness when they heard it. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had known his wife would react with compassion, but seeing it happen made his chest tight with gratitude. Robert, James, and William stood awkwardly near the barn, not sure what to make of the situation. The three brothers had never seen Chinese people before, except from a distance in town. They were curious but trying not to stare. Thomas caught their eyes and nodded toward the house, silently telling them to give the girls space for now. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret immediately went into nurturing mode. She heated water for washing, laid out clean clothes, and started preparing a meal. The girls watched everything she did with careful attention, still ready to run if needed, but beginning to believe that maybe this place was different. The oldest girl seemed to understand that Margaret was trying to help them. When Margaret showed her the wash basin and clean towels, she nodded gratefully and began helping her friends clean up. The warm water and soap felt like luxury after their ordeal. Margaret had put together some of her own clothes for them to wear. The dresses were too big, but they were clean and warm. As the girls changed clothes, Margaret noticed how thin they were, how their hands shook slightly from weakness. Her maternal instincts kicked into high gear. The first real meal they shared was awkward but meaningful. Margaret had prepared simple food, bread, soup, vegetables from their garden. She served generous portions and kept encouraging them to eat more. The girls ate slowly at first, like they weren't sure the food would stay available, but gradually they relaxed enough to actually enjoy the meal. Over the next few days, routines began to form. The girls woke early and immediately started trying to help with household tasks. They seemed to feel they needed to earn their place by working. Margaret tried to show them they were guests, not servants, but they insisted on helping. That's when their individual personalities began to show. The oldest girl had a natural talent for organizing and managing the household. She quickly figured out Margaret's systems and began helping with cooking and cleaning in ways that actually made things easier. Margaret started calling her "my little helper" and began teaching her English words for kitchen items. The middle girl was drawn to the animals. She would stand by the fence watching the horses and cattle with fascination. When Robert was working with the horses one morning, she approached the fence and began making soft clicking sounds. The horses responded to her immediately, coming over to investigate. Robert was amazed. These animals usually took weeks to warm up to strangers. The youngest girl, still recovering from her illness, spent time sitting on the porch watching everything. She had sharp eyes and seemed to be the quickest at picking up English words. When Margaret would point to something and say its name, she would repeat it perfectly and remember it the next day. Thomas's three sons were trying their best to be welcoming, but it was clearly new territory for them. Robert, the oldest at 28, was the most responsible and serious. He made sure the girls felt safe by being predictable and respectful in his interactions with them. James, 26, was more outgoing and often tried to make them smile with funny faces or gestures. William, the youngest at 24, was shy around them at first but showed his kindness through small actions, like fixing a wobbly chair or bringing fresh flowers for the kitchen table. After 2 weeks, something wonderful happened. The youngest girl laughed out loud for the first time. James had been trying to milk a particularly stubborn cow and ended up getting sprayed with milk instead. The sight of him covered in milk, sputtering and surprised, struck her as so funny that she burst into giggles. The sound made everyone stop what they were doing and smile. It was like sunshine breaking through clouds. That laugh seemed to break. Down another wall. From then on, the girls began to show more of their personalities. The oldest girl revealed a gentle sense of humor and started teaching Margaret some Chinese words in exchange for English lessons. The middle girl began spending more time with James around the animals, and it was clear she had an almost magical way with them. The youngest girl started following William around, curious about everything he was doing as spring turned to summer. The transformation was remarkable. The girls had gained weight and their faces had lost that haunted look. They moved around the farm with confidence now, each finding their own place in the family routine. They still spoke Chinese together, but they were becoming comfortable with English too. The oldest girl turned out to be an excellent cook. She began combining Chinese techniques with local ingredients, creating meals that amazed everyone. Margaret eagerly learned from her, and soon their kitchen was producing fusion dishes that were absolutely delicious. The girls seemed to take pride in contributing something special to the family. The middle girl had become James's unofficial partner in caring for the animals. She had a gift for spotting when an animal was sick or injured before anyone else noticed. Her gentle touch could calm the most nervous horse or coax a shy cat out of hiding. James began relying on her instincts and insights. The youngest girl surprised everyone by showing a talent for numbers. When William was struggling with the ranch's bookkeeping one evening, she quietly watched him work. The next day, she shyly pointed out some errors he had made and showed him a simpler way to organize the accounts. Her system was so clear and efficient that Thomas asked her to take over the bookkeeping entirely, but perhaps the most important change was in the way they looked at Thomas's sons. The fear was completely gone now, replaced by something warmer. The oldest girl would seek out Robert's advice when making decisions about household matters. She seemed to respect his thoughtful nature and steady presence. The middle girl and James had developed an easy friendship based on their shared love of animals. They could communicate almost without words when they were working together, and she had started teasing him gently when he made mistakes, a sure sign she felt comfortable. With him, the youngest girl had attached herself to William in a way that was both sweet and natural. She would sit nearby when he was working on accounts or repairs, sometimes helping but often just enjoying his quiet company. William, who had always been the shy one, seemed to blossom under her gentle attention. Margaret watched all of this with knowing eyes. She had raised 3 sons and understood their hearts better than they understood themselves. She could see the way Robert's face softened when the oldest girl smiled at him. She noticed how James always seemed to find excuses to work near the middle girl. And she definitely saw how William's whole demeanor changed when the youngest girl was around. The girls were healing from their trauma and finding their place in this new life. But Margaret suspected that something even more wonderful was beginning to grow. She said nothing about her observations, but she made sure to create opportunities for the young people to spend time together. Thomas watched his expanded family with deep satisfaction. He had acted on impulse that day in San Francisco, but it had turned out to be one of the best decisions of his life. These 3 girls had brought new energy and joy to their home. They had shown his sons what kindness and resilience looked like, and his sons had responded by becoming better men. As summer continued, Thomas began to wonder what the future would hold for all of them. As autumn painted the hills in gold and red, Thomas noticed changes happening around his ranch that went deeper than the changing seasons. His 3 sons had become different men over the past months. Robert smiled more often and took extra care. with his appearance. James whistled while he worked and found excuses to spend time near the barn when the middle girl was there with the animals. William, who had always been quiet and serious, now had a lightness in his step and actually told jokes at dinner. The three Chinese girls had changed too. They moved with confidence now, their faces bright with health and happiness. But Thomas saw something else in their eyes when they looked at his sons. A warmth that spoke of feelings deeper than friendship. Margaret had noticed it too. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she spoke quietly to her husband. "Those girls have been through terrible things, Thomas, but they're healing now. They're becoming young women again, not just survivors." Thomas nodded, understanding what his wife wasn't saying directly. The girls were ready to think about their futures, about love and marriage and building lives of their own. But the situation was delicate. How could he be sure that any feelings between them and his sons were real and not born from gratitude or fear? The answer came to Thomas during a sleepless night in early October. He needed to bring in someone who could speak both languages fluently. The girls needed to know, in their own language, that they had real choices. They needed to understand that they were free to leave, free to say no, free to make their own decisions about their futures. The next morning, Thomas announced he was making another trip to San Francisco. This time, he had a specific mission. In the Chinese quarter of the city, he found what he was looking for, a middle-aged Chinese man named Chen who worked as a translator for the courts and businesses. Chen spoke perfect English and had a reputation for being honest and fair. When Thomas explained what he needed, Chen was initially suspicious. Too many white men had used his services for purposes that weren't honorable. But something about Thomas's manner and his obvious concern for the girls' well-being convinced Chen to make the journey to the ranch. The girls' reaction when Chen arrived was extraordinary. For the first time since Thomas had found them, they could speak freely in their own language with someone who understood not just their words but their culture and experiences. They talked for hours, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. As they shared their stories and feelings, Chen spent 3 days at the ranch, observing the family dynamics and having long conversations with each of the girls privately. What he learned both surprised and impressed him. These weren't broken spirits clinging to their rescuers out of desperation. These were young women who had found genuine love and respect in this unlikely place. On the fourth day, Chen asked to speak with Thomas and Margaret privately. "Your sons are good men," he said without preamble. "The girls see this clearly, but they also need to know that their feelings are being considered seriously, not just dismissed as gratitude." Thomas leaned forward. "What do you mean?" In Chinese culture, marriage is not just about feelings between two people. It's about families coming together, about respect and honor and building a future. The girls understand that they've been rescued from a terrible fate, but they also know the difference between gratitude and love. Chen explained that each girl had confided in him about her growing feelings for one of the sons. The oldest girl admired Robert's steady character and the way he treated her with respect. The middle girl was drawn to James's kindness to animals and his gentle humor. The youngest girl appreciated William's quiet intelligence and the way he listened to her ideas. "But they're also afraid," Chen continued. "They don't want to assume anything or overstep boundaries. They need to know that their feelings are welcome and that marriage is even a possibility." That evening, Cheng gathered everyone together for a conversation that would change all their lives. He explained to the girls in Chinese exactly what Thomas had told him, that they were free to leave at any time with money for travel wherever they wanted to go. They could stay as family members with no obligations, or if there were mutual feelings, marriage was a possibility that would be discussed openly and honestly. The relief on the girls' faces was immediate. For months they had been wondering about their status, afraid to hope for too much but scared to plan for leaving. Now they knew they had real choices. Chen then spoke to the sons, explaining Chinese customs around courtship and marriage. He told them that the girls came from families where marriages were arranged, but that didn't mean they didn't understand love or personal choice. He helped them understand how to show respect while also expressing their feelings. What followed was the most carefully conducted courtship anyone in the valley had ever seen. Robert began bringing the oldest girl small gifts, flowers from the field, a book he thought she might enjoy, a shawl he'd bought on his next trip to town. She accepted each gift with grace and began leaving little surprises for him too. His favorite cookies, a perfectly pressed shirt, a sketch she had made of him working with the horses, James and the middle. Girls' courtship happened mostly around the animals. They would work together training horses or caring for sick cattle, and in those quiet moments they began sharing their dreams and fears. She taught him Chinese words for different animals, and he showed her the secret places on the ranch where wildflowers grew or where deer came to drink. William and the youngest girl found their connection through books and numbers. He began teaching her to read English, and she helped him learn some Chinese characters. They would sit together in the evenings, working on the ranch accounts or reading stories aloud, their heads bent close together over the pages. The transformation in all 6 young people was beautiful to watch. The girls bloomed with the confidence that comes from being genuinely chosen and valued. The sons grew more mature and thoughtful, understanding that love meant responsibility and commitment. Margaret played the role of gentle chaperone, making sure the couples had time together while also maintaining proper boundaries. She taught the girls about American wedding customs while learning about Chinese traditions from them. The conversations were fascinating, and gradually they began planning how to blend both cultures if marriages did occur. By Christmas, it was clear to everyone that 3 love stories were unfolding. Robert and the oldest girl had developed a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. James and the middle girl had found a connection rooted in their love of nature and animals. William and the youngest girl had bonded over their quiet, thoughtful natures and love of learning. Jane made several more visits throughout the winter, continuing to facilitate important conversations about expectations, dreams, and practical matters. He helped the girls understand American laws about marriage and property. He explained to the sons the importance of honor and commitment in Chinese culture. One snowy evening in February, Robert finally worked up the courage to formally ask the oldest girl to marry him. With Chen translating to make sure nothing was misunderstood, he told her that he loved her not because she needed rescuing, but because she was strong, intelligent, and kind. He wanted to build a life with her as his equal partner. Her answer, given in careful English with tears in her eyes, was simple: "Yes, Robert, I love you too." Within a week, James had proposed to the middle girl while they were caring for a newborn calf together. And William, in his quiet way, had asked the youngest girl to be his wife while they worked on the books one evening. All 3 girls said yes. All 3 sons were over the moon with happiness, and Thomas and Margaret looked at their expanded family with pride and joy, knowing that what had started as a desperate rescue had become something beautiful and lasting. The wedding planning could begin. Spring arrived early that year, as if nature itself was celebrating the upcoming weddings. Margaret had never planned one wedding, let alone 3 at the same time. But with the help of the 3 brides-to-be, she threw herself into the task. With joy and determination. The biggest challenge was finding a minister willing to perform the ceremonies. The first 3 ministers Thomas approached refused outright. They claimed it was against God's will for white men to marry Chinese women. Thomas left each meeting feeling angry and disappointed. These were supposed to be men of God, yet they showed no Christian charity or understanding. The 4th minister, Reverend Patterson from the next county, was different. He was an older man with kind eyes who listened carefully as Thomas explained the situation. When Thomas finished, the Reverend was quiet for a long moment. "Tell me about these young women," Reverend Patterson finally said. "Not where they came from or what happened to them before. Tell me who they are now." Thomas smiled and began describing the girls, their kindness, their hard work, their gentle spirits, and the way they had brought joy and purpose to his sons' lives. He talked about how they had learned English, how they contributed to the ranch, and how genuine their love for his boys clearly was. Reverend Patterson nodded slowly. "Love is a gift from God, no matter what language it speaks or what color skin. It wears. I'll perform the ceremony." The relief Thomas felt was overwhelming. He had been prepared to marry the couples himself if necessary, but having a real minister made everything feel more official and proper. Meanwhile, the women were deep in wedding preparations. Margaret had brought out her own wedding dress from storage, hoping to alter it for one of the brides. But the oldest girl gently declined, explaining through Chun that she wanted to honor both cultures in her wedding attire. Working together, the four women created something beautiful and unique. They combined white silk in the American tradition with red accents from Chinese custom. The dresses they made were elegant but simple, reflecting both cultures without belonging entirely to either. The result was stunning gowns that told the story of two worlds coming together in love. The Chinese community in Sacramento heard about the weddings through Chun and surprised everyone by sending gifts and representatives. They brought traditional items, tea sets, silk scarves, and jade jewelry, along with their blessings for the brides. It meant everything to the girls to know they weren't completely cut off from their heritage. Thomas's neighbors had mixed reactions to the news. Some were supportive, having seen how happy and prosperous the family had become. Others were disapproving, muttering about mixing races and foreign influences. But Thomas had stopped caring what narrow-minded people thought. His family was happy, and that was all that mattered to him. The wedding day arrived on a perfect May morning. The ranch had been transformed into something magical. Margaret and the girls had decorated everything with wildflowers and ribbons. Tables groaned under the weight of food that blended American and Chinese cooking. The smell of roasted meat mixed with exotic spices filled the air. Guests began arriving early in the morning. The Chinese delegation from Sacramento came with traditional musicians. Supportive neighbors brought their families and congratulations. Even some people from town who had heard about the unusual wedding came out of curiosity and stayed out of genuine happiness for the couples. The ceremony itself was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Reverend Patterson had worked with Chun to incorporate elements from both cultures. The brides walked down an aisle scattered with flower petals while Chinese flutes played alongside a fiddle. The vows were spoken in both English and Chinese, with translations for everyone to understand. When Robert took the oldest girl's hands and promised to love and protect her for the rest of his life, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. When James kissed the middle girl as his wife, the Chinese musicians played a joyful melody that made everyone smile. And when William and the youngest girl exchanged rings, the quiet power of their love touched everyone present. After the ceremony, the celebration continued all day and into the evening. The Chinese guests taught American children traditional games. Margaret's friends learned to use chopsticks and tried Chinese delicacies. Stories were shared in broken English and creative gestures, creating connections across cultural barriers. The months and years passed. The three marriages proved to be everything Thomas had hoped. Robert and his wife built a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. They expanded the ranch's operations and became known throughout the region for their fair dealing and innovative farming methods. James and his wife specialized in raising and training horses. Her almost mystical way with animals, combined with his patient teaching methods, made their horses the most sought after in 3 counties. They built a reputation that brought buyers from as far away as San Francisco. William and his wife took over the financial side of the ranch completely. Her sharp mind for numbers and his careful attention to detail made them a formidable team. Under their management, the ranch became more profitable than it had ever been. But perhaps more importantly, all 3 couples found deep happiness together. The wives learned to navigate American society while maintaining pride in their Chinese heritage. They taught their husbands Chinese customs and cooking while embracing American traditions like Christmas and Thanksgiving. The children came gradually over the years, beautiful boys and girls, who spoke both English and Chinese fluently. These children grew up understanding both cultures, equally comfortable with chopsticks and forks, equally at home with American folk songs and Chinese lullabies. As anti-Chinese sentiment grew stronger in California during the 1870s and 1880s, The ranch became a safe haven for other Chinese immigrants facing persecution. Thomas and his family helped many people find work and safety, creating a network of support that lasted for generations. The oldest girl became a leader in this effort, using her position as a respected rancher's wife to advocate for fair treatment of Chinese workers. She spoke at community meetings and wrote letters to newspapers, always careful to present logical arguments rather than emotional pleas. The middle girl used her knowledge of animals to help Chinese farmers improve their livestock and farming methods. She became known as someone who could cure any sick animal and teach anyone how to raise healthy cattle and horses. The youngest girl used her mathematical skills to help other Chinese immigrants understand American business practices and legal requirements. She taught them how to keep proper records, pay taxes correctly, and protect themselves from cheating employers. Years later, when Thomas was an old man sitting on his porch watching his grandchildren play, he often thought about that day in San Francisco when he had seen 3 terrified girls being sold like property. He had acted on instinct then, spending his life savings without any plan for what would come next. Looking back, it was clear that it had been the best money he had ever spent. Those 3 frightened girls had become the foundation of a legacy that would last for generations. They had brought joy, prosperity, and purpose to his family. They had shown his sons what real love looked like. And they had created a new kind of American family, one that honored the past while building something entirely new for the future. The ranch still stood decades later, run by Thomas's grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried both Scottish and Chinese blood in their veins. They were living proof that love could triumph over prejudice, that families could be built from the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes the most important decisions in life were made not with the head, but with the heart. Thomas's simple act of compassion had changed not just 7 lives, but had created ripples that spread through time, touching countless others and proving that one person's courage to do what's right can make all the difference in the world.